Welcome to another talk special. The European Union is waiting for sufficient vaccine supplies, and the people do so as well. If the politicians have to justify themselves, it is only to not have ordered enough RNA vaccines. The question that has been relegated to the background in this debate is the question about the safety of the sought-after vaccines. This is what we would like to discuss today. Our guests are Dr. Sylvia Behrendt. Hello, Dr. Behrendt is an administrative lawyer with a doctorate in pandemic law, and she has been an advisor to health ministries on behalf of the WHO about how to reconcile national pandemic laws with international pandemic law, and has collaborated in this respect with the WHO in Geneva. Andrea Steindl has a master's degree in law and works in the field of human rights. Her specialisms include general civil law, administrative law and criminal law, labor law and international law. And Diplom Engineer Clemens Arvi is a biologist with a specialism of health ecology. He is an author of non-fiction books and a member of the Scientific Forum of the European Countries Biologists Association. Welcome. Well, the discussion at the moment is about when do we get enough vaccines. The issue of compulsory vaccination is mentioned now and again a little bit on the sidelines. How do you see this? Is there a possibility for vaccinations to become compulsory, and what are the preconditions for this? When we talk about compulsory vaccination, we have to distinguish if we are talking about a legal duty to be vaccinated, a law which stipulates that every citizen has to be vaccinated, or are we talking about an indirect compulsory vaccination which prevents people who are not vaccinated to do certain jobs or are not able to do certain things? Compulsory vaccination as a legal duty, in my opinion, is legally not possible at the moment because there is no legal basis for that. It cannot be excluded, however, that such a basis will be created in the coming weeks or months. If such a law was to be introduced in Austria, it needed to go through the constitutional courts and had to be checked if it complied with the existing regulations. Like with every constitutional matter, all the preconditions have to be examined very carefully. If vaccination was to really become compulsory by law, this would constitute a massive violation of human rights for every single one of us. First of all, the requirement needs to be examined, meaning how desperate the situation is. Yes, that's right. The necessity needs to be looked at based on our knowledge and insights in the last weeks or months. We already have data on mortality, and on average, thank God, it's only 0.15%. We also know who is affected basically by serious or fatal consequences of the disease. And I think we have to consider these aspects when thinking about the necessity. So the mortality of 0.15% is related to the infected population, not the vaccinated one. Yes, that's right. If we are talking about a legal duty to be vaccinated for each citizen in Austria, we have to look at the necessity. If there is a disease that is dangerous for a certain group of the population, serious illness or even death, how do we justify compulsive vaccination for the whole population? Furthermore, such a law has to be reasonable, and in judging this, it is important to consider for whom the illness is dangerous. We also need to look at what we already know about these vaccines. I think we are miles away from an effectiveness of 100%. For me as a lawyer, it is also very important if these vaccines can make sure that if I'm vaccinated, I cannot pass the virus on to anyone else. Only then does it make sense, in my opinion, to even think about who needs to be vaccinated. Do we really need to create a legal duty, or is it reasonable to do so? Well, something we do not examine enough, and Dr. Behrendt will elaborate on it later, that these three vaccines which are currently licensed, so BioNTech, Moderna, Pfizer and AstraZeneca, only got a provisional license. We are talking about an emergency license, and this is always brushed under the carpet in all these discussions. This would, of course, play a major role when the necessity and reasonableness in terms of human rights of such a law is looked at. For such a violation of human rights, not only the necessity and reasonableness needed to be confirmed, but the so-called legal principle of the less severe means had to be applied, which for me bears the question on how this can be justified. When we talk about an airline refusing to transport passengers who are not vaccinated or have not had corona, or employers who decide only to employ vaccinated people, then this would be compulsory vaccination through the back door, which the legislator could not influence. That's right. This is what I call the indirect compulsory vaccination. I think this would be a much bigger problem in the next weeks, months, or even years. Some airlines have already announced this. We only take vaccinated passengers. What is interesting is the resolution that was passed by the Council of Europe, who has discussed this issue. They were very clear in saying that, first of all, there must not be a compulsory vaccination, and secondly, if a person decides they don't want to get vaccinated, they must not incur any disadvantages or be discriminated against. The discussions were about the fact that people must not be disadvantaged or put under pressure, be it social or political pressure. They are aware of this set of problems. This resolution is very clear, and it says that it is unlawful to make vaccination a precondition to do a certain job, for example. What about people who work in the health sector, so people who work close to patients? This is, of course, being discussed already. Yes, we have some clients from the health sector who contact us because they are put under a lot of pressure. So far, I am not aware of any cases where they were told, if you don't get vaccinated, we have to let you go. This is something that comes up in our legal practice. If someone was to be made redundant because they refused to get vaccinated, we would have to legally challenge this. It is a very big issue in our work as legal advisors. I would like to come back to what you said about the provisional license. One of the arguments from politicians in the area of health, if they want to justify their decision of why they waited so long to order large amounts of vaccines, is that they wanted to avoid a provisional or emergency license of a vaccine. They did not want this provisional license, so this suggests that the licenses were not provisional. Another argument is that the EU has insisted that the liability rests with the manufacturers, but this is also not the case. Are we being lied to, or are there different perceptions? You are touching on different aspects here. One thing are the so-called pre-negotiations, which have been concluded by the EU Commission in pre-contracts, and each country was able to say how much of each vaccine they needed. And these contracts have been concluded a long time before the license or even the application for a license was received by the European Medicines
Das war
Agency.
teilweise, haben die Verträge
The
schon im August, glaube
contracts
ich, begonnen,
partly
die
have been
Verhandlungen und sind
negotiated
auch
and
schon
concluded in
abgeschlossen worden.
August already.
Und diese Verträge
These
sind
contracts
grundsätzlich
have been
mittlerweile
made
öffentlich,
public
nur die
at the
Haftungsklauseln
moment, but the
sind
liability
geheim. Man
clauses are
weiß,
not disclosed, they
also
are secret.
über Medienberichte,
From media
dass
reports, we
die
know
offensichtlich die
that the manufacturers
Biotechnologieunternehmen
are
die
liable to the
Mitgliedstaaten
member
in
states
Verantwortung
if
nehmen,
they get a
sofern
lot
sie
of
sehr
liability
viele
lawsuits and there
Haftungsklagen
is a clear
bekommen und
problem.
ein deutliches Problem offensichtlich vorliegt. Wird es dann im Endeffekt auf die Steuerzahler
This means that
abgewälzt.
the
Aber das sind alles nur
taxpayer has to foot the
Medienberichte,
bill for
weil
it.
uns die
These are just media
Transparenz fehlt.
reports, though,
Uns
because there
fehlt
is
eine
no
Transparenz. Wir
transparency
müssen
for us. There is
diese
no
Impfstoffe sind lang
transparency.
vor
These
der
vaccines have been
Zulassung,
purchased a long time
vor der
before the
Antragstellung
application for licenses.
gekauft worden und jetzt fehlt uns die
And
Transparenz, das
now
zu
we cannot
überprüfen.
verify
Das
this
ist ein
because of the
Riesenproblem.
lack of
Alles, was wir erfahren
transparency.
auf
This is a huge
Pressekonferenzen,
problem.
ist, dass sie
All
es
we get
gekauft
to
haben.
know
Unter
at
welchen
press conferences
Bedingungen,
is that
unter
they
welchen
have bought it.
Preisen,
We are not told under
das
which
erfahren wir bis
conditions or
jetzt nicht.
prices they were
Das
bought.
müssen wir einfordern. Das ist der eine
This is
Aspekt, den ich
something we have
angesprochen
to
habe.
ask for. This is one aspect
Und
you
der zweite
mentioned.
ist die
The other
bedingten
aspect
Zulassungen. Ja, das ist ein sehr nettes
concerns
Wort.
the provisional
Sie sind
licenses. That's
tatsächlich
a nice
einjährig
word.
zugelassen, aber
It
das
is
ist
true that
nicht
they are
die
licensed for
Geschichte, sondern
1
die
year
Geschichte ist,
only.
dass das eine
That's not the
ganz,
story.
ganz
The
klare
other story is that it
Pandemiezulassung
is a
ist.
very clear
Und
emergency
Notfall- und
license.
Pandemiezulassung
An
ist relativ das
emergency
Ähnliche.
license
Also
or pandemic
Amerika und in
license
Großbritannien heißt
is
es
the same. So
Emergency
in America and Great Britain,
Use.
it's called an
Und
emergency
eine
use, emergency
Pandemiezulassung
license.
hat ganz,
And an emergency
ganz
license has
explizite
very
Voraussetzungen.
explicit
Und es
different
geht genau
conditions,
darum, jetzt in der
preconditions.
Öffentlichkeit einmal
It
bekannt
is
zu
now
machen,
very
unter
important to
welchen
make the public
Voraussetzungen es
aware under
wirklich
which
genehmigt worden
conditions the
ist. Weil
licenses
dass es
have
auf
been
ein Jahr
granted.
befristet ist, das ist nicht
The
das
problem is
Problem.
not that they are
Das
only for
Problem
1
ist,
year.
dass
The
es vier
problem is that
Voraussetzungen
there
gibt,
are
die die
4
EMA
preconditions
bzw. der
that the
Ausschuss für
European Medicines
Humanarzneimittel,
Agency or the
in dem
Committee for Human
jedes
Medicines,
Mitgliedsland
where each
vertreten ist,
member
also
state
eigentlich
is represented,
unter
a
Anführungszeichen
national
nationaler Ausschuss,
committee,
dass die darüber in
who have
einem,
to make the decision in
nennen
a
wir mal, sehr
very
subjektiven Verfahren
subjective
eigentlich
and
oder beziehungsweise sehr
risk-based
risikobasierten
procedure
Verfahren das entscheiden müssen, ohne
without
Evidenz oder mit
any
einem
evidence
sehr
or with
geringen
very
Zufall. Also
little
die vier
evidence.
Voraussetzungen sind eben,
So those 4
dass sie ein
preconditions are that
positives
they have to have a
Nutzen-Risiko-Verhältnis
positive
haben müssen, dass
risk-benefit
der
balance,
Antragsteller
that the
diese
applicant can
fehlenden
provide the
Studiendaten
missing study
nachliefern
data
kann,
at a later point in
dann,
time,
dass die Versorgungslücke,
then
die
that the
medizinische,
unmet
geschlossen
medical
wird.
needs
Und
can
das
be
nächste
solved,
ist, dass die
the gap can be
sofortige
closed. The
Verfügbarkeit am
next one
Markt
is
das
that the
Risiko der
immediate
fehlenden Studien
availability in the
überwiegt.
market
Ja?
makes up for the
Und
risk of the
alles
lack of
davor
studies.
hat noch also die ganze
All
Geschichte
of this
davor ist
that
noch,
comes
dass die
beforehand,
WHO
the
vorher
story
einen
beforehand,
öffentlichen
is that the
Gesundheitsnotstand feststellen
WHO
musste.
would
Und diese
have to state a
Verordnung,
public
diese
health
Pandemieverordnung
emergency.
wurde
This
genau,
emergency
beruht
regulation
auf
is
dieser öffentlichen
based
auf
on
diesem
this
öffentlichen
public
Gesundheitsnotstand
health
und wurde
emergency
genau ins Leben
declaration.
gerufen,
And this
nachdem
was
die
created
WHO
at
ihre
exactly the
internationalen
point in
Verträge über
time
die internationalen
after the
Gesundheitsvorschriften
WHO has
verabschiedet hat
passed
mit
its
dem neuen
international treaties
Mechanismus
on the
der
international health regulations with this new
Notfalllage, das
mechanism
Public
of
Health Emergency of
emergency
International
situation.
Concern, also diese
Public health
internationale
emergency of
Bedrohung
concern,
der
as it is
Gesundheit.
called,
Wenn das
this
festgestellt worden ist,
international
dann ist es möglich,
threat to
sekundär
health.
diese vier
If this
Kriterien
has been
anzuwenden.
confirmed, it is
Also das
possible
war,
to
wie gesagt, ein
apply
sehr
the 4
komplexer
criteria.
Aufbau.
That was
Nur,
a
dass
very
man einmal das
complex picture,
Gefühl
just to give
bekommt,
you a
was
feel for
dahinter
what's
steckt.
behind
Also wie
it.
ich verstanden habe jetzt,
If I
heißt
understood
das,
this
dass
correctly,
eigentlich
it means that the
schon die Voraussetzung
precondition
für
for an
eine
emergency license
Notfallzulassung oder eben
has
vorläufige
not
Zulassung
really
gar nicht
existed.
bestanden hat.
Ja, es hat schon bestanden,
Well,
nur
it
die
has
Frage,
existed, but it
es
is
ist
an
eben ein
assessment
Abwägungsprozess.
process.
Und wenn diese vier
If these
Voraussetzungen,
4
also diese fehlenden
preconditions, so the
Studienlagen,
missing
und das ist eben
data,
das wirklich
this is a special
Besondere an dieser
case for
Pandemiezulassung,
pandemic
was er
emergency
unterscheidet zu
licenses.
zum Beispiel lebensbedrohlichen
Unlike the
Krankheiten, da
process
gibt es
for
auch so eine
dangerous
Art
diseases,
Bedingtenzulassung in
there
der
is
gleichen
another emergency license
Rechtsgrundlage.
procedure for
Nur im
these
Fall einer
with the same legal
Pandemie
basis, but in the
ist es
case
so,
of a
dass mit
pandemic, it is
unzureichenden
possible to
präklinischen und
work with
pharmazeutischen Daten
insufficient
gearbeitet werden
preclinical
kann. Und die
and
Präklinik sind die
insufficient
Tierversuche, da
pharmaceutical
weiß der
data. The preclinical work,
Herr Weimer.
that's the
Und
animal test. Mr.
das
Arvey knows
ist
more
ein
about this.
derartiges
It is
Sicherheitsrisiko
such a
dahinter steht,
safety risk
dass
that
man
is
dann im
behind
Endeffekt
it,
diese Aussage,
that
diese
this
Impfstoffe sind sicher
statement,
und
these
geprüft,
vaccines are safe and certified,
suggerieren, es handelt sich um
really
allzugewährte
suggests that these
Impfstoffe. Das ist der
vaccines
eine
are well
Aspekt. Und der nächste
tried.
Aspekt, der hinzukommt,
That's
der auch
one
immer
aspect. The next
sehr, sehr schlecht
aspect added
öffentlich
to this, which is
besprochen
not
wird und
put
diskutiert
in a
wird, ist,
correct light
dass es sich um
publicly
ein
very often, is that
Gentherapeutikum
it
handelt. Und
is
zwar
a
ein
gene therapy drug,
ganz
a
klassisches
classic
Gentherapeuticum, so
gene
wie es
therapy drug,
definiert ist
as
in
per
der großen
definition in the Human
Humanarzneimittelrichtlinie.
Medicines
Und die hat
Directive,
einen neuen Anhang
which
bekommen
has received received a new annex in 2009 about new therapies agrees with the definition of a gene therapy drug. So this annex contains, this revision contains one sentence at the end of the definition which says that the definition of gene therapy drugs does not apply to vaccines against infectious diseases based on genetic manipulation. And this is a legal problem because especially for infectious diseases, they are mostly treated by mass application. Apart from that, it concerns the oncological area, the cancer area. If someone has a life-threatening illness, these gene therapies are applied, and they're very well secured by a safety mechanism. Now, this does not apply here, and that's the reason why it is not defined as a gene therapy drug and does not have to be declared. This is a huge safety aspect behind it, which is measured with absolutely the wrong parameters. They do so consciously. They consciously compare it with measles, with child protection vaccines, but they have nothing to do with these vaccines. The only thing they have in common is the subcutaneous injection. Everything else is new. So if we say that in Europe or in the EU, in Austria, the RNA vaccines we use, if we say that they are licensed in a normal way and not an emergency license, then this is basically wrong. That's right, because Article 8 of the directive states that it has to be declared. It has to be declared to the patient, to the safety personnel, and to the public, which means that not only an indication is sufficient, but the directive states that it has to be declared very clearly. It must be explained under which conditions the license has been granted, and that is missing. This is missing. Basically, such an emergency license is not something bad. It is connected to a period of time for the manufacturer to supply the missing data. That's right. When we talk about a period of time, it is interesting to look at this aspect. BioNTech has until the end of 2023, Moderna until the end of 2022, and AstraZeneca until March 2024. The precondition to supply the clinical studies, which should have been present in the first place to submit the application, are absurd because the application to extend this has to be submitted after 6 months. After these 6 months, the clinical study is still missing for another 1.5 years. This is a huge safety aspect. Where is patient safety in all of this? Is it lawful? That's the question. It goes more and more in this direction. The authorization of drugs within the EU, it is called adaptive pathways. The authorization is closer and closer to the market. They can sell it in a very positive way and say we are adapting it according to the studies. But the other side is that patient safety is disconnected very strongly and that the industry interests are more and more enabled and promoted. We always have to have an eye on this background. Corona vaccines, rescue or risk? This is the title of your new book, Mr. Clemens Avi. We've just heard about the issue of genetic manipulation, gene manipulation. I have not completely understood this. Since 2009, vaccines against infectious diseases containing genetic manipulation or which are leading to genetic manipulation may not be used. Is that correct? Well, they fall out of the definition. They do not have to be declared as such. This means that the end user does not know it unless they have special knowledge about it. Otherwise, it had to be written there, this is a gene therapy drug. But these provisions are not applied, even though it's the same mechanism. It was legally excluded. If it was a drug for cancer, which is a life-threatening disease, it would be protected by the safety mechanisms of the law on new therapies.
So.
Also vor 2009 hätte man uns
So
informieren
before
müssen, wir
2009, they
spritzen
had
jetzt
to
was aus,
inform us
dich
that they are
gentechnisch
injecting us with
verändert oder
something that
manipuliert.
manipulates our
Seit
genes.
2009 muss man
Since
es machen.
2009, they don't have to
Wie
do this
problematisch
anymore.
ist das?
Ja, ich bin ja
How
als Biologe
problematic is this?
nicht für die juristischen
Well, I am not a
Aspekte
legal
zuständig, sondern
expert,
für die
but
biologischen.
I can talk a little bit about the
Man kann das
biological
auch gerne
aspects.
aus dieser Sicht ein bisschen jetzt beleuchten. Ich möchte nur zuerst
I
eine kleine
just wanted to
Korrektur
make a
anbringen. Ich
little
bin nicht
correction.
Mitglied
I am not a
in der
member
European Countries Biologists
of the
Association,
European Countries
sondern diese
Biologists
Association, das ist
Association, but this
eine
association,
Fachorganisation
which
der
is an
Fachverbände
umbrella
der Biologenverbände in
association
Europa,
of
hat mich
the
zertifiziert
Biologists
als European
Association,
Professional
has certified
Biologist.
me
Aber
as
ich
a
bin nicht
European
Mitglied,
professional
nur um
biologist,
das,
but I'm
um
not
das
a
richtig
member.
zu
Keine
stellen.
You
Mitgliedschaft, keine
can't be a member
Mitgliedsgebühr,
of this.
aber
It's a certifying
Keine
body.
Mitgliedschaft, auch kein
So no
Austausch,
membership,
sondern ich
Ja.
bin
no
zertifiziert
exchange,
worden
but I'm
auf
certified
Basis EU,
by them
der EU-Richtlinien als
on the basis
Biologe.
of
Also das
the
ist eine
EU directives
Zertifizierungsstelle
as a
unter anderem.
biologist.
Gut, das wollte ich nur
Okay, well,
klarstellen, dass das
that's
deutlich
something I wanted
wird.
to put right.
Was diesen Aspekt
I would
betrifft, kann
now
ich
like to illustrate
jetzt
this
aus der
aspect
biologischen
that has been mentioned
Perspektive ein
from a
bisschen Licht
biological
hineinbringen. Was
perspective.
ist überhaupt das
What
Genetische
is
an
the
den
genetic
genetischen
part
Impfstoffen?
in the
Ja?
genetic
Weil
vaccines?
was natürlich nicht stimmt, ist, dass die
One thing
genetischen
is
Impfstoffe
not
uns
true,
jetzt
that the
zu
genetic
Mutanten
vaccines
machen, also
transform
genetisch
us into
verändern, wie das oft
mutants
vereinfacht von
or
manchen auch
change
so
us genetically.
salopp gesagt wird. Es ist nicht das
It
Ziel der
is not the
genetischen
aim of
Impfstoffe,
genetic
klarerweise
vaccines to
unser Genom
change
zu
our
verändern. Ja, das
genome.
Ziel ist, dass
It
wir
is their
Antikörper
aim to make
bilden,
our bodies create
Abwehrkräfte
antibodies,
gegen
defenses
SARS-CoV-2
against
bzw. eben
SARS-CoV-2
gegen bestimmte
or
Proteine von
against certain
SARS-CoV-2.
proteins of
Und das
SARS-CoV-2.
wird erzielt bei all diesen
And with
Impfstoffen,
all these
egal ob
vaccines,
mRNA oder
irrespective
DNA
of
oder
whether
virale
they are
Vektorimpfstoffe, die ja nur
mRNA
eine
or
erweiterte
DNA or
Form
all the vector
der genetischen
vaccines,
Impfstoffe sind, wo
which
eben
are
das
only
genetische
enhanced
Material, die
versions of
genetische
the genetic
Information in
vaccines,
ein Virus zuerst
whereby the
eingesetzt
genetic
wird und dieses dann
material, the
eingebracht
genetic
wird.
information is
Also alle
first
diese
of all
Methoden
inserted into a virus
zielen
and
auf
then
die
inserted into our bodies.
Genexpression ab.
So all
Ja?
these methods
Die
aim at genetic
Genexpression,
expression.
sagt schon der
Genetic or
Begriff,
gene
ist der Prozess
expression,
des
as the word
Wirksamwerdens
says, is the
unserer
process
genetischen
of our
Information in
genetic
unserem
information
Körper.
becoming
Das
effective
heißt,
in our
unser
body,
Körper muss
which
täglich
means our
Proteine,
body has to
Eiweißstoffe
build
bauen,
proteins on a
die
daily
alle unsere
basis, which
Funktionen
are the
im
basis for
Wesentlichen
all our
tragen, unseren
functions.
Körper aufbauen. Ja, also unsere
For example,
Verdauungsenzyme
our
sind auch
digestive
komplexe Proteine.
enzymes are
Wir
also
bestehen aus
complex
Proteinen und sie haben
proteins.
viele wichtige
We are made
Funktionen
up
und sie müssen
of
natürlich
proteins
ständig
and they
neu
have many
gebildet
important
werden.
functions.
Und wenn
They,
unser
of
Körper diese
course, have to
Proteine
be
benötigt,
constantly
ein bestimmtes
produced. When
Protein
our
benötigt, muss
body
dieser
needs a certain protein,
Bauplan
the information
aus
to
dem
build it
Zellkern,
has to be taken out
aus
of the
unserem
cell
Genom
nucleus from
entnommen
our
werden und
genome
in diese
and
Genexpression
integrated
eingebunden
into
werden.
this
Und die
genetic
passiert
expression.
außerhalb des Zellkerns,
This
die
takes place
Genexpression. Also wenn man
outside
sich
of
die
the
Zelle
cell
vorstellt, in der
nucleus.
Mitte ist das Genom im
So if
Zellkern
you
und
imagine
dann
our
haben wir
cell, in
sogenannte
the center we
Organellen, das
have the
sind so kleine
nucleus, the
Organe der Zelle,
genome,
die halt
and
täglich ihre
outside of
Arbeit
it we have
leisten.
little
Und wir
organelles
brauchen
doing their
diesen
daily
Bauplan
work.
außerhalb des
We need
Zellkerns
the blueprint outside
und
of the
er
cell
muss der
nucleus.
sogenannten
It needs to
Proteinbiosynthese
be
zugeführt
available for the
werden. Und das ist der
so-called
zentrale
protein
Teil dieser
biosynthesis,
Genexpression.
which is the central
Der
part
Begriff
of the
sagt auch
genetic
schon
expression.
selbsterklärend,
The
es
term is
geht darum, dass
self-explanatory. It's
die
about
Herstellung,
producing
es geht um die
proteins
Herstellung von Proteinen
during
im Rahmen
this
dieser
protein
Proteinbiosynthese oder eben im
biosynthesis
Rahmen
or
der
within this
Genexpression.
genetic
Und dort
expression.
setzen diese Arzneistoffe,
This
diese
is where the
Wirkstoffe in den
vaccine's
Impfstoffen
agents come
an.
in.
Sie manipulieren
They
unsere
manipulate our
Genexpression, unsere
genetic expression,
Proteinbiosynthese,
our
indem sie
biosynthesis,
genetische
by
Information
inserting
dort
genetic information
einschleusen.
into it.
Und da muss man jetzt aber wiederum
Here we have to
unterscheiden. Alle haben
distinguish.
das Ziel,
All of them have
dass
the
am
aim
Ende
of
unsere
manipulating our protein
Proteinbiosynthese läuft in die sogenannten
biosynthesis,
Ribosomen ab.
which is
Das
done
sind
in the
eben
so-called
bestimmte Arten von
ribosomes,
Organellen, von
which are
kleinen
little
Organen, unsere
organelles, little organs, so our
Proteinfabriken,
protein
dass die
factories, in
Proteinbiosynthese
order to
dort
make it
beeinflusst wird,
produce
dass sie also
by
aus Versehen
mistake,
sozusagen, indem man ihnen
by
diese
mistake, so
Information
to speak,
unterjubelt,
by
Proteine nicht
giving
von
them this
uns, sondern von
information, not our
SARS-CoV-2
proteins, but
herstellen.
the
In der
proteins
Regel
of SARS-CoV-2,
des
normally the spike
Spike-Proteins als
protein as an
Antigen.
antigen.
Unser Körper unsere
Our
Zelle
cell
wird
is
als
used as a
Kopiermaschine
copying
benutzt,
machine
ja,
for
für
viral antigens.
virale Antigene. Aber wo man eben unterscheiden muss, also
This
das
is
ist
the
das
aim of
Ziel
all
von
the
allen
licensed
Impfstoffen, die wir
vaccines.
jetzt haben, zugelassen. Wo man
But
unterscheiden muss,
we
ist aber
have
der
to
Weg
distinguish
dorthin.
the path to this
Die
aim,
einfachste
the
Form
way to get
ist der
this.
mRNA-Impfstoff.
The
Jetzt muss
simplest
man
way
wissen,
is the
mRNA steht für
mRNA vaccine.
Boten-RNA oder
mRNA
Messenger-RNA
stands for messenger
und das ist ein
RNA,
Transkript
which is
eines
a
bestimmten genetischen,
transcript
eines
from a
bestimmten
certain section of
Abschnitts
our
aus
genes,
unseren Genen,
of a
einer
certain
bestimmten
genetic
genetischen Information,
information
die einen
that
Proteinbauplan
contains
enthält. Und
a
in uns
certain
läuft auch
blueprint.
täglich ein Prozess
There
ab,
is a
wo eben aus
process in
unserer
our cells on a
DNA im
daily basis whereby the DNA in our cells make these transcripts
The
mRNA, which is then transported to the ribosomes. The mRNA is a so-called cooking recipe. I like to compare it with a protein factory. The ribosomes are the protein factories. So then this messenger RNA is the blueprint, and it is slotted in through a gap, an opening, like with a scanner, you can imagine a scanner, into these ribosomes. They then produce these proteins according to the information on the messenger RNA. The mRNA vaccines take this mRNA into the cell. They do not get to the nucleus, but into the ribosomes, into the protein biosynthesis. The DNA vaccines, there are no licensed DNA vaccines, but AstraZeneca is an enhanced version of a DNA vaccine, which I will explain in more detail later. They do the whole thing in a more complex way. There are integration processes involved, processes which also include the cell nucleus. Eventually, the messenger RNA has to be produced in our own cell nucleus from the DNA inserted. Then this messenger RNA is led to the protein biosynthesis. This is simply a more complex process which involves inserting genetically modified DNA. So you have to add something to the mRNA vaccines. It's often simplified that a piece of messenger RNA from a virus is inserted, a natural product, so to speak. That's the impression you get when you hear the reports in the media. This is not the case. It's a synthetically produced messenger RNA from the laboratory. First of all, DNA is genetically modified, genetically manipulated, and then this mRNA is harvested from the DNA using certain enzymes. Finally, we have a synthetically produced, genetically modified mRNA in the vaccine with BioNTech and Moderna, for example. The third variation, as I said, we can skip over the DNA vaccines because there are no licensed DNA vaccines to date, but one of them is progressing quite quickly. The American company, is called Inovio, and this is also in the third clinical phase. AstraZeneca has a viral vector vaccine. Here the information for the spike protein is inserted in the form of DNA. It's very important, DNA. It is possible to code the information contained in the coronavirus, which is an RNA virus, as DNA. So you can translate it and then insert this information as DNA, as with the DNA vaccines. This DNA is inserted into a vector virus, into a so-called adenovirus, which is a DNA virus. This is genetically manipulated and carries the information to produce a spike protein of SARS-CoV-2. The function of this virus, which is a genetically modified chimpanzee virus, is only to insert it in our cells. Then a complex integration mechanism takes place, which temporarily involves the cell nucleus, so that finally the messenger RNA, this is always the end product, the messenger RNA is present in our cell and is processed through the gene expression, and the protein biosynthesis produces the viral antigen. So for all those listeners who feel or felt, as I do, like an 85-year-old doing their first computer course, what is the problem? The big problems we have is not so much what we know, but what we don't know. The shortening of the licensing processes lead to a lot of open questions. As we have heard, the studies have not been completed, cannot be completed. The third clinical phase cannot be completed in a short time. Data has to be handed in retrospect, until points in time far into the future, when millions and billions of people will have already been vaccinated. And we also have to make clear that these vaccines do not have a safety history in human medicine, not a satisfactory safety history, meaning that, for example, before the licensing of these mRNA vaccines, there has never been a licensed mRNA vaccine for an infectious disease before in human medicine. In the past, there were even only a few single cases where the first clinical phase of 3 had been completed, and no completed second clinical phases, so certainly no third phases. We have to know that in the first clinical phase, under 100 participants are involved. So before COVID-19, the safety history of mRNA vaccines was definitely inadequate. But it is not a disadvantage if researchers make progress in this area. Yes, but this is about the time frame where this happens. If, for example, there is also a preclinical phase with animal testing in the laboratory, other tests have to take place as well, cell cultures, animal testing, then there is the first, second, and third clinical phase. So if we push this all together, it is called telescoping, like a telescope pushed together. There is not only an acceleration, but no waiting times anymore. It is true indeed that test phases have been started here before the previous test phase had been evaluated. The phases were pushed into each other, and what is very important is that long-term observations and waiting times were abandoned. There it is very important to say that it is not correct. It's not correct if representatives, mostly from the vaccine industry, claim that long-term observations are not needed, especially with such new vaccines. They often say that 95% of side effects occur several weeks after vaccination. This may apply to the first reaction of the immune system to the vaccination, which are flu-like symptoms. They are significantly high in all of those vaccines. If you compare it to traditional vaccines, these new ones all have a very strong reaction with a decline in white blood cells, so a very strong immune reaction. They always say, and they always say, this is what we want. That is certainly true, but we also have to look at the significantly stronger reaction than for most of the other licensed vaccines. So this means that an effective vaccine does not necessarily have to provoke such a strong reaction. I would like to make very clear, however, that this is not the problem. What is brushed under the carpet are the adverse effects, the negative effects that vaccinations can have afterwards and that can appear only after months or years. They are the problem. These are things we cannot easily preempt. This is only possible through waiting time and long-term observation. I would like to give you an example which shows this set of problems and which is evidence against the argument that we don't need any long-term observations. Some years ago, there was a viral vector vaccine against HIV, which was examined and had to be stopped already in a second clinical phase. After a long-term observation time of 4 years at the time, it became clear that after 18 months of vaccination, the vaccinated people showed a higher susceptibility to become infected with HIV. In my new book, I have explained in detail how this effect happened. And here I would like to shorten it a little. It's about complex immune biological reactions and correlations. Then it became clear, this also was confirmed in animal testing, that, by the way, it was an adenovirus type 5. It was a different one to the one that's used by AstraZeneca, by the way. It was deducted from this that vector vaccines in other vaccines, so this adenovirus could increase the likelihood to become infected with HIV and other infectious diseases. Now, we have to know that such vaccines based on this vector technology, are relatively far advanced. We might have the pleasure of experiencing these as well at a later stage. And the vaccine researchers working on these vaccines have warned in the Lancet, in the medical journal, that they do not understand why such vaccines now have already made it into the third clinical phase. This is an example which shows that time-delayed effects, which are only clear after some time has passed, can really happen. And they can never be covered by a telescoped test procedure that has been shortened. This is why the world record so far of a vaccine being licensed is a little bit more than 5 years. This is a vaccine against mumps. Normally it's about 8 to 10 years on average. The third clinical phase alone lasts at least 2 years, often up to 6 years. There are good reasons for this, because the long-term observations are necessary. If the viral vector vaccine against HIV, which I mentioned, had been rolled out under a telescope procedure, then this adverse effect, increased susceptibility to become infected with HIV, about 18 months after vaccination, had not been discovered, and within this time frame, millions and billions of people would have already been vaccinated if there were these masks. From your point of view, Sylvia, what are the biggest problems in relation to these licenses?
Wir haben das jetzt schon sehr gut erklärt bekommen.
Well, we have just heard a very good and
Die
professional
größten Probleme, würde
explanation.
ich auch sagen, sind eben diese
I would
mangelnden
agree that the biggest
Sicherheitsdaten. Man
problems
sieht
are the
manchmal das
lack of
dann,
safety data.
man hat viel jetzt
We've
gehört
heard a
über
lot about
Todesfälle.
fatalities.
In Österreich gibt es als
In
offizielle
Austria,
Angabe,
the Federal
also das
Institute for
Bundesamt für
Health and
Sicherheit im Gesundheitswesen
Safety,
zuständig, die hat Sicherheitsberichte. Da drinnen steht,
which
Österreich
is
hat
responsible
700
for this, their
Nebenwirkungen
safety
gemeldete, bis lieber
reports
718
reported
Tote.
700 adverse
Und
effects and 18
ein
deaths.
sehr, sehr, sehr großes Problem sehen die Juristen,
A
glaube ich, können
very
übereinstimmen
big
sein,
problem,
in
which the
den
lawyers see
Erfassungen der Todesfälle,
unanimously,
weil
is the way
eben
the deaths
ein
are
derart
recorded,
komplexer Mechanismus angewandt
because
wird,
it is
der
such a complex
mit
mechanism which is
Sicherheit
used,
nicht zu einem sofortigen
which
Obduktionsausschluss kommen
surely
kann, dass das
cannot
kausal mit der
come
Impfung
to
zusammenhängt.
Das heißt, da müssen wir dann die Frage stellen, an oder mit
conclusion
der Impfung
during the
gestorben.
abduction to
Genau.
prove that the
Und
cause was the
diese
vaccination.
Unterscheidung kann man,
So
glaube ich, zu
it's
dem
either
Zeitpunkt
died off
in
or
dieser
with the
Form
vaccine.
nicht ganz
Yes,
lapidar treffen, so wie es
and
in
we
diesem
cannot make this
Sicherheitsbericht drinnen
decision
steht,
lightly in
weil,
this
außer es
way,
wäre zum Beispiel
according
jetzt
to the safety report, except
Verkehrsunfall. Ja.
if
Aber
we
wenn
are
es jetzt
talking
kein
about a
Verkehrsunfall
traffic
war, man
accident.
weiß auch nicht das
But if it
Alter,
wasn't a
man nimmt
traffic
an, es sind
accident,
Alte, aber es steht
we
kein
don't know
Alter
the
dabei.
age,
Es
we
steht
assume
dann
it's
eine
older
sehr
people, but the
interessante
age is not
Information
recorded.
dabei, dass man
And then
rechnet
there's a
pro
very interesting
200,
piece of information
ich kann es jetzt nicht
included,
genau wiedergeben,
that the
jedenfalls pro
calculation is
290
made
plus
so for every about
65-Jähriger
290
ein Toter oder so ähnlich. Also ganz
of
interessant, kann man gleich
the plus
gegenrechnen einmal mit den
65-year-olds is
Covid-Statistiken. Da
one
braucht es
death
einen
or
eigenen
something like
Statistiker,
that. Very
diese
interesting. We
offiziellen Aussagen zu
can do the
untersuchen.
calculation for COVID deaths and
Jedenfalls
compare it, but we need a
muss man
statistician to
eine
examine
große
these official
Diskussion
statements.
anfangen oder
Anyhow,
besteht eine große
we need to start
Pharmakovigilanz
a
Pflicht,
large-scale
die
discussion,
Nebenwirkungen zu
and there is a
erfassen und
huge
in dieser Art und
pharmacovigilance
Weise die
duty to
Toten quasi
record the
einfach
side effects,
auszustoßen und sagen,
and
na, du
not
bist
to
ja vor 2 Wochen
exclude the
geimpft
deaths
worden,
in
aber du
this
bist
way
ganz
and
sicher
say,
kein
well, it's true that you were
Impftoter,
vaccinated 2 weeks
kein
ago, but surely you did not die of the
ist, glaube
vaccination.
ich,
This
unrechtmäßig.
is not
Die
legally correct.
Nebenwirkungen, wo man sagt,
The
das eine
side
sind Impfreaktionen,
effects,
das andere eben
or we
tatsächliche
have
Nebenwirkungen, müssen
the
erfasst werden.
reaction to
Wer
the vaccine,
übernimmt
and then
die
also the real
Erfassung?
side
Also ich
effects
als
have
Geimpfter
to be
selbst kann
recorded.
ich
Who
merken, da wächst der
records
Schwammerl
them?
aus dem Kopf.
If I was
Hilft beim
vaccinated,
Arzt
for
melden, wen
example, I
geimpft
noticed
hat,
that
oder
my
muss
head is
der
fuzzy, do
Genau, es
I
gibt eine
have to report
Verpflichtung
this
und
to
das
the
ist
doctor who
genauso
vaccinated me? Yes, there
Produktkennzeichnungsverpflichtung
is
wie
a
diese bedingte
duty, and
Zulassung, das ist
it
die
is the same
Pandemiezulassung.
compulsory
Es
labeling
steht, wenn man den
like this
wenn man die
emergency
Packungsbeilage mal
license.
aufmacht, die
If you open the
Gebrauchsinformation,
package
da steht als
insert,
erstes ein
you
schwarzes
see,
Symbol,
first
so
of
ein
all, a
schwarzes
black
Dreieck
symbol,
und
a
dann
black
steht,
triangle
dieses
with the
Arzneimittel
following text.
unterliegt einer
This
besonderen
drug is
Überwachung.
subject to special
Und
monitoring.
dadurch soll ein
And this
Letztanwender, der
is
wahrscheinlich diese beiden
supposed to
Absätze nie sehen
alert
wird,
the
wo er
end
nicht hinschaut,
user,
aber trotzdem
who in most
achtsam
cases never
werden, dass
sees
er
this
Pflichten
insert,
hat,
to his
genauso wie
duties,
sämtliche Gesundheitsberufe,
just as the
die
health
Nebenwirkungen
professionals,
zu melden.
to
Ganz
report
hinten
the
steht dann
side
auch, man soll
effects.
sie da melden.
And at the end of the insert,
Also
it tells you where to
das
report
muss
it.
auch, das sieht man auch,
This
diese
makes the
Sicherheitsstufe.
safety
Natürlich hat das
aspect
einen
clear.
Grund, warum
Of
ich das
course, there
melden
is
muss
a
und warum
reason why I have
dieser
to report
Warnhinweis
it,
verpflichtend einzubringen ist.
why
Und
there
der war
is a
ganz
warning
interessant in
note,
dem Zusammenhang,
and why there
wenn ich
is a
das kurz
duty
erwähnen
to
darf,
report
die
it. In this
Stellungnahme der
context, it was
Bioethikkommission hat
interesting,
das
if I
zum
may
Beispiel
mention
als
this
neue
briefly, the
Idee
statement of the
Postulierungen
Bioethics
umschreiben und sagt,
Commission.
Sie möchten gerne
They
ein
said
Register erfassen für die
that they
Nebenwirkungen.
would like to
Das
record a
möchten Sie nicht,
register
sondern
of
das
side
müssen
effects.
Sie.
They
Und
do
das
not
ist
like
Pflicht
to
und
do
das
this,
ist der
they
Subject
have to,
und die
they are
Studien und
legally
Daten
bound to do
fehlen,
this,
weil wir nicht wissen, welche
because the
Nebenwirkungen
study
es
data are
gibt.
missing. because we don't know what side
sind
effects there are.
fahrlässige Aussagen.
These
Und das
statements are
Allerinteressanteste
negligent.
war, dass dann gestanden ist, sie
And
möchten
the most
gleichzeitig
interesting thing is that the
Nebenwirkungsregister für
statement
Nichtgeimpfte
also
und
said
dort die
that they would
Langzeitschäden
like at the
untersuchen für
same time to
Nichtgeimpften.
record the
Also
long-term damage
ja,
for
das
non-vaccinated
ist
people.
schwer zu verstehen.
Well,
Sollte dann
this
jeder, der sich
is
impfen hat
hard to
lassen,
understand.
ein
Every person who was
Post-Impf-Tagebuch
vaccinated
führen?
has to keep a
Ja, das wäre wichtig. Vor allen Dingen
post-vaccination
wäre es
journal.
wichtig, dass
Yes, that
die
would be
Bevölkerung
important. Most of all,
ganz
it is
wachsam
important
ist,
that the
mit
population is
sämtlichen
very
Folgen und alles
vigilant
eingibt. Man kann
about
auch
all
im
the
Web vom
side effects
Internetportal
and
des
records them.
Bundesamtes für
There
Sicherheit
are
im
online
Gesundheitswesen,
forms on the Internet
BASG
portal of the
heißt
Federal
das.
Agency
Da
for
gibt es
Health and Safety.
Online-Formulare, da kann man sie
You
online
can
direkt
enter it
alles
online
ausfüllen. Dann
and
wird es
then it will be
dementsprechend
well
gut
documented.
dokumentiert. Genauso wie jeder Arzt wird es gut dokumentieren. Aber es ist
It's
wichtig, auch daran zu
important to
denken und
remember
auch nach
it,
3 Monaten daran zu
to
denken,
remember to do
und
this
auch nach
also
einem
after
halben Jahr
3
noch dran zu
months
denken.
and
Weil
after
natürlich
6
die
months.
Denkweise jetzt ganz neu ist, wir
The
sind, oder
government's
das
aim is to
Ziel ist ja der
vaccinate
Regierung, dass wir
everyone with these
durchgeimpft werden. Und zwar die
vaccines they have
gesamte
bought
Bevölkerung mit
already.
diesen Impfstoffdosen, die sie ja gekauft haben. Und da hat die Bioethikkommission
The
gesagt, was sollen wir
Bioethics
machen, wenn
Commission
da was
said,
überbleibt.
well,
Ja?
what shall we do
Da soll
if there are
offensichtlich
any
nichts
left over? If we
überbleiben.
bought too many,
Und darum
well, they
müssen
have clearly
wir
not planned to have
umso
any left
wachsamer
over.
sein,
We have to be all the more
Nebenwirkungen auf einer
vigilant
ganz
to
breiten
record the
Basis zu
side
erfassen.
effects on a
Aber
broad
natürlich hat es dann
basis.
schon betroffen zu dem
But of
Zeitpunkt.
course, at this point in
Das ist
time,
ein
you are
großes
already
Problem. Aber
affected.
Da muss ich
This
noch
is
was
a big
dazu sagen, wenn ich
problem.
darf ich kurz?
I would
ja,
like to
ja.
add
Es
something,
ist
if
noch
I
ein
may.
wichtiger Aspekt, es geht auch
An
um die
important aspect
Wirkungsweise.
is the
Wir haben ja noch gar keinen
effectiveness.
Nachweis,
We
dass
do
man
not
zum
have any
Beispiel
evidence yet
das Virus
that
nicht mehr
you
an andere
cannot
weitergeben kann. Dass man
transmit
zum
the
Beispiel nicht
virus.
symptomatisch erkrankt und dann
For
das Virus
example,
an
if
andere weitergibt.
that
Das
you
heißt, es ist
get mild
sogar
symptoms
von der
and then pass the
Datenlage davon
virus on to
auszugehen,
others. If you
dass
look at the
keine
data,
oder nur
it
eine
becomes
geringe
evident that there is
sogenannte
no or only
sterile
a small
Immunität eintritt. Das ist
so-called
also die
sterile
Durchbrechen der
immunity,
Infektionskette.
which would
Man
break
kann
the
also nicht
infection
nur
chain.
selbst nicht mehr
If
erkranken,
not
sondern das Virus auch
only
nicht
you could
weitergeben.
not
So
get
wie es
the
jetzt
illness,
ausschaut,
but
haben wir es
also
mit
you would not
Impfstoffen zu
pass
tun,
it
die
on to
eine
others.
schwere Erkrankung bei den
So
Geimpften verhindern,
we are
die
dealing with
vielleicht
vaccines
eher
at the
zu einem
moment
milden
which
Verlauf dann
prevent a
führen,
severe course of the
aber dass
illness
das
for the
Virus
people
eben trotzdem
vaccinated.
weitergegeben werden kann.
They get
Und
a mild
das
form of
ist
it, but can
etwas, was
still pass the
unverständlich
virus
ist,
on.
dass man also
This is something
hier
that
zu
is hard to
bedingten Zulassungen kommt,
understand,
bevor überhaupt die
that
Wirkungsweise
an
geklärt ist. Bis
emergency
hinauf ins British
authorization has been
Medical
granted
Journal wird
before
das zum
even being
Beispiel von
clear on the
Peter
effectiveness.
Doshi
In the British
und
Medical
Hamish
Journal, Peter
Duncan, zwei
Doshi, for
Medizinern.
example,
Peter
and
Doshi
Hamish
ist sogar
Duncan,
einer
two
der
medical
Chief Editors
professionals.
des
Peter
British Medical
Doshi is one of the chief
Journals,
editors of the
wird das
British Medical
kritisiert.
Journal,
Und
and
sie haben
they
sich diese Studien auch
criticize this.
angeschaut. Das ist auch in meinem
They
Buch
have
alles
looked
genau
at this
erklärt.
study, it is
Sie
all
sind zu
explained
dem
in
Punkt
detail in my book,
gekommen,
and they came to the
Peter Doshi hat dann
conclusion.
auch eigene
Peter Doshi
Nachrechnungen
has
angestellt,
conducted his
dass zum
own
Beispiel bei
calculations.
den
So the
Wirksamkeitsnachweisen
conclusion was, first of all, that there is a
zunächst mal durch die geringe
relatively
Anzahl derer, die in
small
dieser Zeit überhaupt
statistical
erkrankt sind, sowieso
basis
eine relativ magere statistische
because of the
Datenbasis
small number of
vorliegt,
people
allein was
being
die Wirksamkeit im
infected. So
Schutz des
there is
Individuums
a
betrifft.
relatively small
Dann hat sich
statistical
herausgestellt, dass
basis
es zu fast
for the
4000,
protection of
etwa
the individual.
3500
Then it became clear that there were nearly 4,000, so 3,500
Verdachtsfällen gekommen
suspected
ist, die halt
cases,
aber kein
but who did
positives
not have a positive
PCR-Ergebnis hatten.
PCR
Man muss aber
test
wissen, dass bis zum
result.
8. Tag
You
nach
have to
der
know that
Übertragung
up
des
to
Virus
8 days
ein
after the
falsch
COVID
negatives
infection, there can
PCR-Test, wie wir
still
aus einer
be a
Studie
false negative
wissen, ein
PCR
falsch
test
negatives
result, as we know from a study,
PCR-Ergebnis vorliegen
even
kann,
though these
obwohl diese
people
Menschen
are
bereits
already
infiziert sind.
infected.
Das heißt, hier gibt es Zeitfenster, dass
So
man
there are
auch
time windows
möglicherweise
here
zumindest einen Teil
that
dieser
at least
Verdachtsfälle
part of
einfach
these suspected
falsch
cases
negativ
were
getestet hat, weil man
tested
sie zu früh
and had a
getestet hat.
false
Und
negative
er
result
stellt also hier
because
im
the
British
tests were
Medical
done too
Journal
early.
andere Berechnungen an und kommt allein schon beim Schutz des
So he does
Individuums
other
zu weit
calculations in the
geringeren
British Medical
Werten,
Journal and concludes
als
that the
dies von den
protection of the
Konzernen selbst
individual alone
verlautbart wurde.
is a lot
Und
smaller
was
than
man
the
eben auch
manufacturers
wissen muss,
claimed.
wo
Another
was
thing
die
we have to know
Fragezeichen bei der
is
sterilen
that the
Immunität, bei der
question marks
Unterbrechung der
concerning the
Infektionskette
sterile
ganz massive
immunity, the interruption of
Implikationen
the
haben, wenn
infection
wir jetzt davon
chain,
ausgehen müssen, dass die
have massive
Infektionskette nicht
implications.
unterbrochen wird, so wie es jetzt aussieht.
If it is the
Welchen
case that
Sinn
the
hat es
infection
dann,
chain is not
per
interrupted,
Zwang, per Druck,
and
sei
this
es nur
looks like to be the
moralischer Druck
case,
oder
does it make
sozialer
sense to put
Druck
pressure on
des
people,
Dienstgebers,
be it
zum
only
Beispiel
moral
Menschen
pressure,
in
social
Kliniken im
pressure, pressure of the
Gesundheitswesen zu
employer,
impfen,
to
wenn
vaccinate
die das
people, for
Virus ja
example, in
trotzdem
clinics,
weitergeben
in the
können?
healthcare sector, if they
Möglicherweise
can
hat
still
hier
pass
auch
the
einen
virus on?
adversen Effekt
It
in
is
einer anderen
possible that an
Form,
adverse
nämlich dass
effect
man
could
sich als
occur here in
Geimpfter dann
another form,
sicher fühlen
that that people who are vaccinated feel safer, they think they cannot pass the virus on and are less careful. This would be disastrous in the health sector. There is another argument, a second argument. For a long time, I have been working with eco-immunology and evolutionary medicine, which is about medicine in the context of human evolution and the evolution of pathogens. vaccines.
zahlreichen Studien
Numerous
belegt, dass
studies
schlecht
show that
wirksame
poorly
Impfstoffe,
effective
vor allem
vaccines,
wenn sie
especially
die
if they do
Infektionskette
not
nicht durchbrechen,
interrupt the
dazu
infection
führen
chain,
können, dass die
could
Mutationsrate des
lead
Virus
to the
ansteigt. Das
mutation
nennt man
rate
auch
of the virus going up.
Escape-Mutationen.
This is
Also
also
das
called
Virus versucht
escape
von
mutations.
den
The virus tries to
so
get
recht oder
away
schlecht
from the
schützenden
weak
Funktionen des
defense mechanisms
Immunsystems
of the
zu
immune system
entfliehen und entwickelt
and
dabei auch neue
develops new
Fähigkeiten. Ja? Es kommt zu neuen
capabilities.
Mutationen. Es sind
There
ja
are
auch im
new
Virus
mutations. The
evolutionäre
virus is subject to
Regelkreise, die da
evolutionary
wirken. Eine
development cycles as
Intelligenz
well,
der Natur,
an
sodass Viren
intelligence
immer
of
wieder Wege
nature,
finden, das
so
Immunsystem
that
auszutricksen.
viruses always
Und wenn
find new ways to
eine
trick the
Impfung
immune
jetzt eben
system.
nur mich
If a vaccine
schützt
only
oder nur zu
protects
milden
me
Symptomen führt,
and
aber
leads to mild
die
symptoms,
Weitergabe
but
des
it is
Virus
possible for me to
möglich
pass the
ist, die
virus on.
Infektionskette nicht durchbrochen
So
ist,
if
dann
the
kann sozusagen
infection
ich
chain
auch
is
zu
not
einer Art
interrupted,
Schule
then
dieses
I can
Virus für
become
neue
a
Mutationen
school,
werden und ich
kind of
gebe das
school for
Virus
the
dann an
virus, to
andere
find new ways
Mitgeschützte
to
ab.
Beim
mutate.
Polio-Impfstoff war
And I
das
will
so.
pass the
Also
virus on to
da gibt
others
es
who are
viele
not protected.
Beispiele, das
This
ist
was
in
the
der
case with
evolutionären
polio.
Medizin auch nachgewiesen.
There
Es
are
ist
a
größte
lot of
Vorsicht
examples. It is evidenced in
angebracht mit
evolutionary
Impfstoffen, die
medicine.
nicht
Vaccines
zur sterilen
not
Immunität führen und
leading
auch
to
sonst keine
sterile immunity
gesicherten,
and where there is
wirklich
no
guten
secured evidence of
Wirksamkeitsnachweise haben.
effectiveness
Vor
need to
allem,
be
wir
treated
sprechen ja
with
eben immer von
extreme
Impfstoffen, die an
caution,
Millionen und Milliarden von
especially if we
Menschen
talk about
verabreicht werden.
vaccines who are
Diese
given to
Effekte sowohl bei
millions
der
of
Wirkung als
people.
auch bei der Sicherheit
These effects are
multiplizieren sich ja
multiplied.
dadurch. Das ist das
That is
Wichtige. Das hat
important.
schon William Haseltine gesagt, der
William
bis heute als
Haseltine, as
Kritiker
one of the
dieser
most renowned
verkürzten
virologists
Verfahren
and genetic
auftritt, einer
engineers,
der
has already
renommiertesten
said this.
Virologen und
He
Genetiker.
remains a critic,
Andreas
the most
Steindl,
renowned
wie
critic of
schaut
these
es dann
shortened
aus
authorization
mit
procedures.
der Haftungsfrage? Es
Andrea
gibt
Steindl,
einmal
what does
einen
the liability
Verantwortlichen,
look
das ist der
like?
Hersteller, es gibt einen
There is
Verantwortlichen,
a
das ist
responsible
eine
entity, which is the
Regierung, die eine
manufacturer.
Impfempfehlung
There's also the government who
ausspricht, der ein
recommends people
Produkt dafür
to
besorgt hat.
get
Es gibt
vaccinated
den
with the
Arzt,
product it
der ein
has bought.
Impfungsrecht hat. Wie schaut es da
And
aus,
there is the doctor
wenn
who
es tatsächlich
vaccinates
zu
people.
Folgeschäden
What
kommen
is the
sollte?
legal
Wer haftet wofür?
situation? Who has the
Ja, das ist eine
liability
sehr
for any
spannende Frage.
consequential
Die
damage?
Silvia hat das vorher
This is a
schon
very
angesprochen. Also
fascinating question. Sylvia
inwieweit
has
die
already
Hersteller
mentioned
da
it.
herangezogen werden können, ist fraglich. Ja? Und
It
wenn
is
sie herangezogen
questionable how
werden
much of the
können, dann werden sie
liability
wahrscheinlich
rests with the
Regress nehmen und
manufacturers.
wir
If
sind im
they are
Endeffekt
sued,
wieder
they're most
der
likely going to
Steuerzahler
appeal
selbst
against it,
zahlen.
and
Also
the
jedenfalls eine
taxpayer
Grundlage ist
has
das
to bear the costs
Impfschadengesetz,
themselves.
wobei
A
das
basis
nur
is the law on
sehr in
vaccination
sehr beschränkten
damage, which
Umfang
is
der
only very
Hilfestellung ist.
limited.
Also da werden nicht alle Schäden ersetzt, wie man sich das vielleicht so vorstellt. Ja.
Not all the
Wenn man
damage
da
is
am Ende des
covered.
Tages
If
wirklich einen
someone should
schwerwiegenden
experience very
Schaden
serious
erleiden
damage
sollte durch so eine
through the
Impfung,
vaccination,
ist
this
mit den
law is
Ansprüchen aus dem
very
Impfschadengesetz
insufficient
leitend,
to
das
cover
Ausnahmen
it.
zu finden. Unabhängig davon ist natürlich auch sehr
Apart
schwierig, so
from
einen
this,
Anspruch
it is
durchzusetzen. Ja.
very difficult to
Das war
assert
bis
such a
dato schon
claim.
so. Also wer schon so ein Verfahren geführt hat
Traditionally,
aus dem
it
Impfschadengesetz weiß
always
das.
has been
Man muss als
difficult.
Geschädigter,
You
als
have to
Patient
prove
quasi
that the vaccination was the
nachweisen,
cause for the
dass die
damage,
Impfung kausal war. Ja,
the
man muss diesen
causality or the
Kausalitätsbeweis
causality
antreten, beziehungsweise die
likelihood.
Kausalitätswahrscheinlichkeit. Man muss quasi nachweisen, dass
You
wirklich die
have to
Impfung
prove that the
schuld ist
vaccination was the cause,
an
that
dem ich
no
jetzt
other
leide.
cause
Man
is
muss
more
auch
likely,
nachweisen, dass nicht eine andere Ursache wahrscheinlicher ist.
and
Und es muss auch der zeitliche
it has
Zusammenhang
also to be
stimmen.
timely,
Und
a
zusätzlich muss
time
sozusagen ein
connection.
typisches
And in
Risiko sich
addition to this,
verwirklicht
a
haben.
typical
Und da
risk needs
stelle
to have
ich mir jetzt schon
manifested.
die Frage,
The question
wir
I am asking
diskutieren schon
myself
seit
is,
längerer Zeit
we
darüber,
are discussing for a
was wir
while
alles
about
nicht
what we
wissen.
don't know.
Und wir wissen sehr viel nicht.
We don't know
Es
a
wurde
lot of
beispielsweise
things.
auch nie getestet,
For example, it
Wechselwirkungen
has
mit
never been
Medikamenten.
tested how the vaccines
Das heißt,
interact with other
wenn ich jetzt
medication.
einen Schaden erleiden
So,
sollte aufgrund eines dieser
meaning that if I
Impfstoffe,
were to
woher
suffer
weiß ich,
health
was da ein
damage because of
typisches
one of these
Risiko ist,
vaccines,
das
how
sich
do
da
I know what a
verwirklicht? Ja?
typical
Und
risk
gerade wenn wir
is
da hören, dass sich das nach
when we
so
hear
langer
that
Zeit
after
auch noch
such a long
quasi
time there
zeigen
can be
kann,
side effects?
stellt sich für mich schon die
I'm
Frage, wie
asking
man das als
myself
Geschädigter
how
dann
to
durchsetzen
assert
soll. Ja?
this as a
Und wie
damaged
ein
party.
Sachverständiger dann in
How
einem
does an
Verfahren
expert in
nachweisen
a
soll,
court
dass
case
das diese
prove that
Impfung
it
war,
was
dass der
this
zeitliche
vaccine,
Zusammenhang noch
that
gegeben
there is
ist
a
und
time
dass es keine
connection and
andere
no other cause
wahrscheinlichere
is
Ursache
more
gibt?
likely?
Ich habe da von Ihnen einmal einen Beitrag gehört
I
auch,
remember one of
da hat
your
es doch diese
contributions.
Nebenwirkungen
There
gegeben,
was a
die
case of
Entzündungen
bone
im
marrow
Rückenmark.
inflammation.
Da wurde auch schon im Zuge der
In
Studie
the
gesagt,
study,
die
it was
eine
already
Probandin hat
mentioned that
Multiple
one of the
Sklerose
test
gehabt und
people
das
had
ist darauf
multiple
zurückzuführen.
sclerosis and
Also
that
diesen
this was
Nachweis
the
zu
cause.
erbringen, stelle ich mir
I
persönlich
imagine it is
äußerst schwierig
extremely
vor.
difficult to prove
Ja,
the
und dann bleibt noch
causality.
der Arzt, ja,
And
am
then the
Ende quasi
doctor
der Kette,
remains in the end, who,
der
according to
wie
experts,
Experten meinen, ein
should
20 bis 30
conduct
minütiges
a 20 to 30
Aufklärungsgespräch führen
minute
sollte im Zusammenhang
consultation
mit diesen Impfstoffen.
before
Ich wage zu
vaccinating.
bezweifeln, dass das derzeit so
I am
praktiziert wird,
more
ja,
than
was man da so
doubtful that
hört aus
this
den
is actually done done at the moment from what we hear about the old people's homes and clinics.
Ja, würde diese Aufklärung gemacht. Ja, würde diese Aufklärung gemacht, würde es sich ausgehen.
So if this information had been given, but we have very different perceptions. I represent adults and sometimes they call me on the phone in passing and I need to decide quickly whether someone will be vaccinated or not. I am doubtful that these 30-minute consultations take place. In Austria, we really have a very strict liability law for doctors. The High Court is very strict, and if they find that the doctor should have conducted a thorough consultation, and if he had done this, then his patient would not have been vaccinated, then the doctor is liable for any damage. That's what I think.
Muss man vielleicht auch kurz einhaken bei der
I would like to come back to this vaccination campaign. I see problems with the duty to provide information because the latest issue of this medical journal is a real cause for worry. Any advertising for pandemic vaccines is strictly prohibited under the Austrian Medicine Act. Completely not allowed. Persons of public trust, like doctors, are not allowed to advertise for vaccines publicly. You are not allowed to present them in a way that suggests they are free from adverse effects. You are not allowed to claim something that is misleading.
Genau, und das wird einfach so gemacht. Wir wissen eben nicht, was
this is what they are, but this is what they are doing.
Wir wissen nicht,
we do not know how virus transmission works. We do not know how long the protection lasts for symptomatic cases, and we don't know if an asymptomatic scenario can be prevented. This is true for all three vaccines. How can they then make a statement like, we are not going to be taken to a hospital anymore and not going to die from it anymore? This does not exist. We know very little. We know that the mild symptoms become milder. Talking about the vaccination campaign, the question for me as a lawyer is the people involved and also the doctors agreeing to do this. The National Vaccination Commission, they have also issued the two documents, the prioritizing and usage recommendation. When they issue such a document, they know they are not allowed to do this. They are experts, not lay people. The question for me behind it is a question about democratic policies. What are they aiming at? Are we deprived of our right to make decisions? Does the citizen under no circumstances get negative information because he is supposed to get vaccinated? And is the ability to make decisions taken away from us? I also have to make other decisions every day. I can't deny responsibility for these, so why can't I be fully informed about these pandemic vaccines by the experts who you cannot sue, unfortunately, because the liability is hardly tangible? The Federal Health and Safety Agency should do this. But we need to ask, why are we not able to accept this information? Are we not able to accept this information, and why would we not get vaccinated if we did this? This stands in the room, and we should be allowed to discuss it in public. If I go to the web page of the European Medicines Agency, you have to scroll down. They have an online register for each vaccine. When you scroll down, you get this public assessment report, which is public. This public assessment report, it has about 100 pages. What is in there? You simply have to read it to understand it, and then you have to compare it with the package insert. It's alarming. To just take one example for BioNTech, it's quite interesting. Reproduction and fertility and pregnancy. There is a rat study. It's quite nice. The little rats became pregnant and got little rat babies. The rat children had already had neutralizing SARS-CoV-2 antibodies. antibodies until the time after breastfeeding. This is what the original report says, but the package insert says, if you are pregnant, please consult your doctor or pharmacist. It does not say that rat studies have confirmed already that the neutralizing SARS-CoV-2 antibodies were present, and so that they were genetically modified. This is not included, but we are all vaccinated. The BioNTech study has confirmed that the female test persons, 23 of which became pregnant without intending to, and those children have not been born yet. This is really negligent to pass the responsibility on to doctors in this way. This reminds me of a dark chapter in the history of medicine. The good news, the rats got rat babies. That's right, but they were already genetically modified. If I understood this correctly, I often talk to the stakeholders and they often say, you'll see, the children will be fine, or you will see in 2 years' time everything will be okay. The problem is that vaccine safety does not work like this. Vaccine safety and the precautionary principle do not mean we will see that everything will be okay, but we have to exercise great caution and empirically prove in advance, before authorization, before usage, that the risk is minor and the benefit is great, to put it in a simple way. This is the major point. This cannot happen through leaving out waiting times and using the telescoping method. One more point concerning the transverse myelitis, the inflammation of the spine that you mentioned. In AstraZeneca tests, there were 11,000 participants who received the vaccine, the viral vector vaccine. 2 people got a transverse myelitis, an inflammation of the spine, where nerve tissue just disappears. This is something which can lead to paralysis in the worst case, so a serious complication. We have to say that this is a relatively high rate, 2 of 11,000, 1 of 5,500. With BioNTech, there were over 20,000 participants with no case of transverse myelitis. AstraZeneca is taking it too easy when they say it is a coincidence. In the other vaccine studies, this did not happen, but in an AstraZeneca study with 11,000 participants, it occurred twice. There are only preliminary assessment reports. It's crazy. People have to know this. It's only preliminary. These include that one case of myelitis was a multiple sclerosis patient. It is possible that someone who has MS may get transverse myelitis, that's correct. However, the point in time is noticeable. One of these cases occurred 1 week after the first or second vaccination, and the other case 2 weeks afterwards. So these cases occurred within 1 or 2 weeks after the first or second vaccination. They occurred close in time to the vaccination. I now have to ask myself, is it possible that the vaccine leads to certain interactions for people with certain health conditions, or also on medication that you have mentioned, that people with certain health conditions develop severe autoimmune reactions of the nerve tissue, which would be the worst case, like this MS case. There are people who do not know anything about their existing health conditions. That's one case. The second case, it only says in the report that it is an idiopathic transverse myelitis that is probably not connected to the vaccine. This does not give us any information. Idiopathic means nothing less than we don't know the cause. Idiopathic means I don't know why. Casually speaking, it just occurred. We cannot find a cause. The vaccine can be the cause, but the vaccine does not have to be the cause. That this is brushed under the carpet with this vaccine, that is going to be given to millions and billions of people, is a scandal in my opinion. I demand a public discussion in the media of this, that we ask questions and that these things are not brushed under the carpet. We may get to the conclusion that there is nothing to worry about, but it has to be put on the table, it must be discussed. Just to say idiopathic, and we have not found a cause with this one case, It will be connected to the MS illness, is not satisfactory from a point of view of vaccine safety. And one more point on this that confirms it. This vaccine was compared to a meningococcal vaccine, which is very unusual, a licensed meningococcal vaccine. Normally you would use a placebo. It already has quite a bad side effect profile, so a relatively high reactivity, flu-like symptoms and so on. Compared to this, even the AstraZeneca vaccine was significantly higher regarding the flu-like symptoms, but this is only a small detail. With this meningococcal vaccine, there was also a case of transverse myelitis, a bone marrow inflammation, but more than 67 days after vaccination. This is a completely different time frame than 1 to 2 weeks with the AstraZeneca vaccine. Now, you could argue that an accidental occurrence of such a severe complication in 2 test persons so close in time after vaccination cannot be brushed aside easily with a preliminary report and pushed aside these concerns. Pushed aside. Switzerland has not authorized this vaccine. Yeah, in the scientific world there are great concerns, especially around this vaccine, which is supposed to be the vaccine for the masses now. All I am asking for is that these concerns are publicly discussed and that the media, and I like what you said, as a lawyer I did not know this, that it is unlawful to pretend that there are no side effects, and this is exactly what is happening in the media. There is a reason why there is a law to this effect. This was the gold standard before COVID. It would not have been possible. No doctor or authority would have dared to do this. Neither the National Vaccine Committee with 18 members, very high-profile experts. To go to this level and withhold this information to the public is not lawful. So to conclude the discussion, what are we going to do now? What do those people do who have already rolled up their sleeves and are waiting for the injection? Some people because they are afraid of the virus, and others because they think they can help conquer the pandemic and the restricting measures, the feeling of being locked up or being really locked up. What are those people supposed to do? To get informed, to get as much information as possible, and then make a free decision on the basis of the information. This is also the purpose of my new book, Comprehensive Differentiated Information. And then everyone should make the decision for themselves, and I would like to call on all people to stop exerting moral and social pressure on people who decide not to get vaccinated for good reasons. There is one way of making vaccination compulsory, political, be it directly or indirectly, and there is the social way of making vaccination compulsory. This is what we're experiencing very strongly at the moment. This also is not justified because the moral argument leads to absurdity, because a significant sterile immunity, an interruption of the infection chain, is at least not proven yet and will probably not exist. Your call to get information, we have discussed this before, is becoming more and more difficult to decide where to get the right information. If I do not want to get lost in the internet among 25,300 reports and videos, but I would like to get information from a reliable source which really tells me this is good for you or it's better to leave it. Where would you go? What would you advise? Where would you get this information?
Also wenn man fachlich Top-Information will oder die beste, die es verfügbar gibt, ist
If you want to get the top technical information available, then go to the European Medicines Authority, who has this online register and is duty-bound to update it. You can enter, for example, Community, that's the name for BioNTech, EMA for European Medicines Authority, and then you come to the internet page straight away. This is easy to find. So there you find all the reports, and there is a short short Q&A section. It's very user-friendly. I can't remember the exact wording, but there you find the question, what protection does it give us? The answer is given as, that is at the moment something we do not know. You have to go through the questions, and then you find the public assessment report and other safety reports and information. It's a bit laborious, but this is the information which is 100% reliable. The vaccination campaign, unfortunately, is one-sided, more than one-sided. They say it's effective and safe, and this is something we cannot confirm if we look at the facts. It cannot be confirmed. Each individual has to make the decision that is right for them. You have to really engage with things, as we have heard. We've heard from Mr. Ari and Ms. Barrett to ask for advice. I myself work as a legal advisor. Information is the most important thing. That's the way it is. On that basis, you can make an individual decision for yourself. Don't allow others to put pressure on you. And most of all, if you are feeling under pressure, to inform yourself on whether this is possible, whether an employer can demand that I get vaccinated, apart from the social pressure, of course. As I said, to date there are no pending legal procedures on this issue. I am sure a legal challenge of redundancy on that basis would be exciting. I cannot imagine that this is a justified reason to make an employee redundant because they say, I don't want to get vaccinated with any of these vaccines. I don't want to get vaccinated yet. I would like to wait and see what's going to develop in the coming weeks or months. In view of the lack of speed of the vaccination program, the good news is that most of us have enough time to get informed. Thank you for being here, and thank you for watching. Get your information and make a wise decision.